Okay, I am Josh Summers, and this is Meaning of Life TV. And today I am with Tami Simon. Tami, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Josh. Great to be with you.
To introduce you, Tami, at the age of 22, you started a multimedia publishing company called Sounds True, which for over 20 years now has focused on disseminating spiritual teachings through a variety of platforms. You also have come to host a podcast called Insights at the Edge and have recently edited a volume of essays called The Dharma of Dogs. Subtitle is Our Best Friends as Spiritual Teachers, which we'll be exploring at some point during this conversation. But really from the beginning, it sounds like your work and personal passion have been merged in a kind of non-dualistic process from very early on. And I just wanted to say at the beginning, at the outset of this conversation, on a very personal note, that even though we haven't met before, in many ways I feel like I have come of age through some of the productions and recordings of Sounds True. As a kid, I used to subscribe to the Columbia Record Club, and on a weekly basis I would get an album from Columbia with a pop record or something. And then as I got into college, those pop records, you could say, matured into receiving box sets from people like John Coltrane or Miles Davis. But then as I got into spirituality, meditation, and yoga, I started receiving a different set of kind of box set in the mail. And it was box sets with collections of teachings from people like Richard Freeman, Thich Nhat Hanh, Adyashanti, Ken Wilber, Pema Chodron. And your voice was a central thread in all of those teachings, whether you were introducing these teachers in the productions or conducting your own in-depth interviews with those teachers. So I just want to sort of, at the beginning, give you a note of personal gratitude for what you've done. And maybe begin with this simple question. At the age of 22, how the hell did you start a publishing company?
Yeah. Well, I didn't know what I was doing, so I think that was an advantage. What I did know was that I wanted to make some kind of positive contribution, that I completely loved the Dharma, and that it had been a lifeline, literally, in my own life and experience. And books I read as a teenager by Herman Hesse and Alan Watts, those were books that, it's not just that I loved them, it's that they allowed me to feel like perhaps I belonged on the planet, and that I could be here, and that if other people had found a way to take their angst and their deep questioning and turn it into something meaningful that would be useful to other people, that I could do the same, and I could make those kinds of great teachings in a contemporary form available to other people, and that would be an act of service. So that's really the seed of what was alive in me.
Mm-hmm. But at 22, what was your experience level like at that point?
Yeah, so I went to college, Swarthmore College, thinking that I would major in philosophy because I was interested in the meaning of life. I soon transferred over into the religion department because I was interested in personal mystical experience, not so much an academic version of having thoughts about other people's thoughts. I was really interested in direct experience. And in my sophomore year in the religious studies department at Swarthmore College, I met a gentleman from Sri Lanka who was there for 1 year only on a Fulbright scholarship teaching Buddhism and existentialism. And he and I became fast friends, and I spent quite a bit of time in my sophomore year going over to his house in the evening and spending time with his wife and 3 kids and eating Sri Lankan curry. And soon at the end of my sophomore year, I left and went to Sri Lanka to live with his family. And it was at that point in my time in my life that I became exposed to meditation. And I started meditating with Goenka, who teaches a style of Vipassana meditation. And that was a real turning point in my life when I started meditating. And at that point, I dedicated my life to trying to bring those kinds of teachings to other people. And when I came back from my year of traveling, I went from Sri Lanka up into India and studied with Goenka at his center in Igatpuri in India, and then traveled up to Kathmandu. When I finally came back to the United States, I was unfit for further academic training, and instead was really in my own process as a person. And at a certain point, my father died. I was 21. I inherited a small amount of money, and through a sequence of events, decided to use that amount of money, around $50,000, to start Sounds True.
Wow. A couple of things are bubbling up in my mind as you're talking there. One, for those people that may not be familiar with Goenka as a teacher, he sort of disseminated a very specific brand of Burmese Vipassana practice, right?
Yeah.
And it's sort of this style of practice that has centers all over the world where if you go, it's the same rigorous course of practice wherever you may attend, and it involves watching the breath for a few days and then scanning your mind through your body over and over again. And it's quite a powerful practice, as I understand it.
Yeah.
And
very, very, very physical.
Very physical.
And very much focused on working with a body scan where you go from head to toe and you're concentrating. So you're feeling every little pore of your skin. You can imagine that, starting from your toe, going all the way up to the top of your head, and then working with the sweeping motion up and down the body. And, it's a type of spiritual boot camp for 10 days, complete noble silence, real noble silence, all 10 days, from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. a day for a 10-day period. I was fortunate that I had the chance to actually study with Goenka himself when he was still actively teaching.
Right. It is, as you say, it is a kind of boot camp, and it seems to have kick-started many, many spiritual careers in a way, or spiritual practice trajectories for people, that it's their first big dose of an in-depth experience like that. But as you do say, it is kind of body-focused, and so one of the questions I wanted to hear about a little bit from your perspective was, did you feel that approach, while it may have deeply connected with you on certain levels and may have even made you feel better about some of the angst that you were experiencing prior to leaving for Sri Lanka, do you feel in hindsight that maybe some things were neglected or bypassed within that approach? Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, so that approach was my first introduction to meditation. And as you said, it's a way to get a real taste because of the intensity of the schedule and the practice itself. What happened for me is that I started developing a strange kind of like body tick, where I started kind of going like that a lot. Hey, you have a dog at your house.
I have a dog, and I was wondering if
Cool.
A delivery was going to show up and sort of force us to segue into the talking about dogs.
Well, I'm so glad it's not going to have a good conversation about the Dharma of dogs without that
some
protective love of your dog
right.
coming into our conversation. So I developed, after these 4 intensive 10-day meditation retreats that I attended as a young 21-year-old, a kind of nervous tick. And it was a way that I couldn't actually metabolize the intensity of the energetic awakenings that were happening in my body. And so I stopped meditating for quite some time. And then I did some Kundalini meditation training. And part of it was I was trying to really learn how to work with that energy. But for me, it wasn't until later in my life when I met a teacher, Reggie Ray, who teaches somatic meditation, or meditating with the body, that I really learned how to ground in the energy of the earth and how to be able to have a big enough space of groundedness coming into me that I was able to open up from the base of the spine up and have a way for that energy to flow through me. So I needed a different kind of earth-based practice to help me ground. That's what I needed.
As I'm listening to you, I'm realizing that the topic you're bringing up now is actually not really discussed very openly At least it hasn't been discussed very openly on this particular platform. When meditation has been discussed, it's primarily been in reference to kind of the cognitive shifts that occur as a result of a meditative practice. But I've been around the block enough to know that there are these conditions or these dynamics that occur in intensive meditation where, as you're saying, there can be this real surge of an energetic kind of explosion at times that can, I think the way it's described narratively is that the nervous system hasn't adapted or isn't prepared enough to handle that kind of surge. And I remember hearing that there are even these places called Kundalini crisis centers, where when the Kundalini is awakened in such a way, which is this energetic current coming up, that people have to go and get special forms of body work, acupuncture, et cetera, to sort of manage it. And so I guess the question I have for you, just in terms of your own practice and working with Reggie Ray around that, how did things shift? What was different in the meditative emphasis of the earth-based practice, as you're describing it, that allowed you to integrate that experience?
Yeah, there was an opening from the perineum down into the energy space of the earth. And that opening allowed this kind of infinite field of grounding that I really needed as a person. So I no longer felt when I was meditating that I was like this Kundalini hot wire on top of the earth trying to find some way to not go into a crisis center. I didn't feel that way anymore. Mm-hmm. Instead, I felt like there was this huge space under me that I could fall into that was a tremendous, vast resource of peaceful, slow-beating darkness in which I could feel not just enveloped, but pacified in a certain way that allowed the energetic flow to happen in an uninterrupted way, kind of like a wire that got grounded.
Yeah,
would be the best way I could put it. Yeah,
I was trying to think of that. What is that? The grounding wire in a house that that takes electrical charges down.
And it was available in my energetic system, but I didn't know it. I didn't know how to open in that way, and I didn't know how to root in that way while in the seated posture. So meditating more just made me more, frizzy. Once when I learned that grounding technique, then meditation became more of an open flow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this brings up the broader issue of how, as people go deeper into certain spiritual practices, there are these kind of strange pathologies that can arise, and the necessity for sort of knowledgeable guides along the way who can say, oh, this is going on, you need to tack left, you need to go into this type of practice. And for you, was that just a sort of synchronistic stumbling upon Reggie's work, or how did that come for you?
I wish it wasn't. I mean, I didn't meet Reggie till I was 39 years old. And so I meditated off and on throughout my 20s. I tried different ways of working with Kundalini energy, from putting strange oils on the base of my spine to working with different kinds of breathing practices to doing eye gazing with a teacher to help ground me directly, eye to eye. I mean, I tried a lot of things. And mostly what I did, quite honestly, was I got really grounded through working. I worked a lot, it sounds true. And there was just something about that kind of day labor, if you will, that helped ground me as a person. And so that was good. But I didn't find a way until I was 39 and I met Reggie. And so the reason I wouldn't say it was so synchronistic is by that time I had worked with a couple hundred different spiritual teachers and I wasn't particularly even looking anymore. I thought I'll just have to find my own way of integrating through work, which was working for me. But when I met Reggie and I learned these practices, I also knew that I'd found a gift and an open doorway that I was following through.
Mm. So you returned from Asia after a year or so of intensive practice? and then
Yeah,
and then started the company Sounds True, which is primarily producing it back then audio recordings of various teachings, correct?
correct. Yeah.
And let me think here. One thing that, one trajectory that a lot of people have is that they go abroad, whether to Asia or someplace else, and go deep into a particular teaching, but they come back and actually start teaching. And it seems like you kind of avoided that fork. Did you have any call to teach?
No. So first of all, just to paint an accurate picture, I came back, I had hepatitis. I weighed 90 pounds, which is quite thin compared to my current weight, especially. And on top of it, I wasn't talking, which of course I think was a big concern to my parents. And I wasn't talking because I thought that most people talked to fill space, and there wasn't really a reason to fill space. That space was a wonderful thing and we could relax into it. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So I probably should have gone in to one of those Kundalini crisis centers that you talked about. I didn't, but I did drop out of college and decide that through living life, I would find my way. And the idea of teaching was nowhere on my map because I was pretty lost and confused, actually. Yes, there had been some great openings, but I was not doing such a great job of integrating and bringing it into anything like a meaningful whole where I could teach other people. What I was interested in was learning. I was interested in learning what happened to me, first of all, and how can I integrate this experience and be of service. So those were the things that were interesting to me. And I felt in dropping out of college that in a way my learning path as a person had been very painfully interrupted because what I wanted to learn, they weren't teaching in academic institutions. But there was a lot that I wanted to learn about the spiritual path. So in many ways, I saw Sounds True as sort of setting up my own learning laboratory that could simultaneously be of benefit to other people who wanted to learn. So that was my orientation.
Yeah, and it sounds like the way you're describing it, it sounds like you came back pretty battered.
It was strange. It was strange. I mean, I was fragmented, and yet I was also. It's like a grenade had gone off inside me, and in that I knew there was something more real than real that I had discovered. And that would be the light in my life forever. And at the same time, I needed a lot of help understanding my experience, articulating my experience, and I had a lot of questions as well about the spiritual journey that were alive in me. And I wanted to talk to the most experienced people and learn from the most experienced people who weren't teaching in academia at the time, but were teaching workshops and intensives and different things coming through Boulder. And so that was the audience of people I wanted to learn from.
And when you started this was pre-internet age, correct?
Yeah.
This was in 1985. So we're not talking, there's no digital stuff. You were transmitting things vis-a-vis cassettes.
Cassette.
Yeah. It's hard. I'm sort of getting a wave of nostalgia just thinking about it.
Yeah.
So you started out with cassettes and cold calling these teachers, asking for interviews?
Well, part of the story that I didn't get into was that one of the ways that I wanted to continue my education, even before I started Sounds True, was that I thought I could interview people for our local community radio station as a volunteer, community radio volunteer. And I'd gotten involved with community radio in college. And when I came to Boulder, I thought, oh, okay, so this is even before I started Sounds True. I want to interview spiritual teachers as they come through Boulder, and that's a way that I can keep learning. So I started a radio show called Live from Planet Earth, where I interviewed people once a week and developed this little cottage business at home where I had a dubbing cassette deck and I would press the buttons, and for $10, I'd sell a little cassette of my 60-minute interview that I'd done with a spiritual teacher. And interestingly, people liked it. They liked my interview style. They were buying these, I'd sell 5 to 10 a week, something like that. And so that had all happened before my father died and I received this inheritance. And that was kind of the seed of what became Sounds True.
Got it. And so over the years, Sounds True has evolved. Now, multimedia industry or business putting out courses too, in addition to audio teachings. And of course, you have your podcast. The thread that I kind of want to pick up on is something that you wrote about in the introduction to the Dharma of Dogs, was that there was a kind of medicine in your own life that came vis-a-vis your first. I don't know if Jasmine was your first dog, but it sounded like maybe your first real significant dog.
Yeah.
And that's it's kind of getting this back to the question I had was something left out in your deep spiritual practice in Sri Lanka and India, and even years after that needed to be met in a different way, that somehow the practice wasn't doing it completely.
Oh, sure. So I think I answered that question initially when you asked it, just by talking about an energetic opening that wasn't nourished. But the deeper thing was that as a person, I found that it was pretty easy for me to enjoy my solitude, being on a cushion. Solitary meditation retreats on the whole were pretty enjoyable and even blissful for me. But intimacy is something that really has been quite challenging for me until the last decade of my life. And I put a lot of time and energy and therapeutic dollars into that endeavor to become somebody who actually loves intimacy and is comfortable being close with another human being. And Jasmine, this 40-pound Cocker Spaniel who became a 30-pound Cocker Spaniel when she was at her fighting weight, blonde, big-boned beauty, came with my partner, Julie, from British Columbia. So at the time, Julie was 27 and Jasmine was 3 years old. And we were able to spend 14 more years with Jasmine. She died when she was 17. And I fell as much in love with Jasmine as I did with Julie. I fell in love with both of them. They really were this glorious package that came together. And yes, what I'd say that I learned from Jasmine that I didn't learn from solitary meditation practice was how to love and be connected to another human being. But it was Jazz, a dog. She wasn't a human being. But in a way, she was. What I mean by that is she was such a full being. It was such a full relationship that even as I was telling you that story, it was like, is she another, you know what I mean? She was Jazz.
And she's still alive in your consciousness of her.
Oh yeah, as I'm talking,
right.
I can see her. I have a picture of her right on my desk. I'll have to grab that. Here we go. Jazz.
Beautiful. Friends of mine just adopted a Cocker Spaniel that looks somewhat similar.
Uh-huh.
And they're besotted right now. As you're just talking about that, I think this is an important point to underline, is in that kind of from the outside perspective, people think of spiritual practice as more or less being a panacea. Like if you're going to practice and go deep and have these deep attainments, that it's probably going to solve or resolve many of your internal conflicts. And, as practitioners, that that's just not the case. I know that that's not the case, but there is that kind of false perception in the world at large that if someone goes really deep in meditation, if they are truly attained in meditative skill, then this intimacy thing would just not be an issue at all, or internal conflict wouldn't be an issue at all. And as one of the writers and teachers that you've worked with over the years, Ken Wilber, talks about, there's different lines of development, right? So that you could have a deep, very advanced line of kind of consciousness awakening through a meditative discipline, but yet be completely underdeveloped in a line of interpersonal skill or intimacy quota, if you will. And it sounds like that's what you were finding in your own
Yeah.
path.
And without even applying Ken Wilber's, model
Psychograph or
of,
what? Yeah.
yeah, his psychograph of the different lines and levels of development, what happened for me, and it was in my relationship with Julie, here she comes to live with me from Canada, and I'm doing these month-long retreats. And at a certain point, she just looked at me and she said, you leave over the Christmas holidays when it's also my birthday and the New Year, and you're off on retreat. And when you talk about the depth of what you're doing, it's about opening to love, really. It's one of the ways you talk about it. And this love that knows no boundaries and includes everyone. Well, what about loving me and not being gone during this time? And I'm suffering. What about that? Okay, that was a pretty big moment for me. What about that? And I had to tell myself the truth, that I was much more terrified to spend that kind of time with Julie, 2-3 weeks on a vacation together, something like that. That was so much more terrifying to me than going to a meditation training or a meditation retreat. And I was like, well, that's interesting too. Why is that so scary? Tami, what are you actually scared of? This person that you say is your closest human being and beloved.
Looking back, I can relate to what you're describing, and I wonder if, in hindsight, do you see your approach to your own practice as a kind of spiritual bypass, where you were maybe using the practice to go around the discomfort you had with intimacy? Because I know I have.
Yeah, I don't know if I was actually using it to spiritually bypass. I think it was nourishing me in a deep kind of way. But then when Julie came into my life, it was clear that something else was called for.
Mm-hmm.
And if I didn't follow that, it would have been a spiritual bypass. I feel fortunate that I did follow it. And I did just tell myself the truth. No, I'm not going to go and prioritize that over the quality of the most important relationship in my life. I'm going to make that relationship number one. It's number one. I can find another time to go on retreat if I want, where my partner doesn't suffer and doesn't feel like I'm leaving her during an important time of the year. Let me find a different time. So it was about getting my priorities straight. So no, I don't think in my own life, to be honest,
Mm-hmm.
that it was so much a spiritual bypass. I think it was an evolution and a readiness. And really, until Julie came into my life and she was my partner, I wasn't ready. The partnership dynamics weren't ready. But then when she was there and she's like, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go deep. Come on, come with me. I knew that that was the next phase of my own growth and learning that I had to prioritize. And it wasn't easy for me. And back to Jasmine, the four-legged part of the equation, I think Jasmine was a great help and aid in that, because unlike Julie, who had a lot of things that she wanted from me and requests and can you listen more or whatever, Jasmine, as we see in a lot of the stories in the Dharma of dogs, when people talk about these great relationships they've had with their four-legged friends, had an incredible unconditional presence in my life. She was just there connecting with me heart to heart. And that made it, I think, easier in a way for me to soften and for the shell of my heart, which had been there up until that point, to start to really crack open. And Jazz was a big part. It was a team, there was the therapist, Julie, and Jasmine, and my work with Reggie as a meditation teacher, all kind of together helping. I mean, it took a village to open this cracked shell,
Yeah, you used the word constancy when you described Jasmine's
Yeah.
presence. And I think it was in the backdrop, that sense of constancy was in the backdrop of, you mentioned somewhere in another interview I heard with you, sort of unskillful, or maybe not so unskillful, but unhealthy attachment formation that started very early on with maybe your parents, which this is a big thing now, is attachment theory and what kind of attachment style you have in early life and how that sets you up for different kinds of attachment in later life. Something that I've tried to bring some attention to in my own life as well and seen how it gets played out. But there does seem to be something about the healing effect of just the simplest, the constancy from the dog.
Yeah, and just to connect the dots with what you're saying very briefly. So I had a smothering Jewish mother, and so it didn't feel safe for me to be around intense intimacy because I thought I would get taken over, right? I'm going to get taken over just like my mother tried to take over my individuality. So I had to push her away in order to be a person. Okay, now here comes Julie. She wants to be all connected, reminds me a lot of my smothering mother, even though it's not that. But here's Jazz. And Jazz says, we can be connected, but I won't take you over. And I'm like, look, that little four-legged who's sleeping in the corner, she's not going to take me over. This is safe. We can be connected. So it gave me the experience of opening up to a connected field that wasn't going to screw up my sense of autonomy. And that was incredibly healing for me.
And you, professionally, with Sounds True, you've opened up your business to be a very pet-friendly environment as well, correct?
I would say a over-the-top pet-friendly environment.
So describe that a little bit. Describe that.
Well, I mean, it has its issues. We have a whole section of our employee handbook that relates to dogs. It Sounds True, and what we write is 3 poops and you're out. 3 poops inside the building, although we don't really enforce that. But on any given day, it Sounds True, there's about 100-ish people who work in our 2 buildings, our warehouse and our publishing office, and there's about 25 dogs in the building that are supposed to be with their human companion. There are these dog gates, baby gates behind many offices. Anyway, so this is a very, very, very pet-friendly environment. There's 1 cat that comes in occasionally and a small bird that occasionally also comes into the office. And, it can be noisy when they bark. It can be disruptive when people come in who aren't dog lovers or who are allergic. But overall, we do this annual survey of all of our employees, and people can write in. There's a section just about what you like best about Sounds True and what you think we should change. And almost always the dogs get mentioned the most of any factor under what they like best about Sounds True. It's a huge humanizing force. It's a huge love force. Yeah. Yeah.
And was it, I assume that was one of the conditions that ultimately gave rise to, or the intention around this book, The Dharma of Dogs.
I think it's what got a bunch of us excited about it. It's like, we're such a dog-friendly place. We're the right company to publish this book. But the idea came originally from an editor that we work with, and it was her idea to publish a book like this. And then when it got introduced, our whole team loved it. And we broadened it a little from her original idea to not just talk about different aspects of the Buddha Dharma, but to just be, what is it that we learn from these 4-legged canines that have some kind of contract with human beings? What do we learn from them that changes us and fuels our spiritual growth as human beings? What are the gifts that they give us? And can we enumerate that? And will that be inspiring and helpful to people? And I think it has been.
And so that's a perfect segue. What do you see then as sort of the central teachings of a dog-human relationship? Beyond, like you mentioned, constancy, so we talked about that, but
sure.
Beyond the constancy and the unconditional love, which I just want to qualify as is not universal unconditional love necessarily. It's specific unconditional love to the owner or the human that is in relationship to the dog.
Yeah, meaning they could bite other people.
Yeah,
or something like that.
Expose a lot.
Yeah. No, I think the reason people, just to stick with the unconditional love for a moment, and then I'll answer the question, say that a lot is, even if, you make a mistake with your dog and forget to put the water out when they need it or something like that.
Or you snap at your dog.
Or something like that. There's this sense that they forgive you and come back around into relationship with you. So I think that's what's meant by that. But I like something that Eckhart Tolle says about dogs. He calls them guardians of being. Guardians of being. And I think one of the things that we lose touch with, whether it's because we're in a hyper cerebral rational place or because of the speed of our culture, is what is our connection with being, with being. And if you hang out with the dog and you pet their belly, if they sleep next to you with their head on their lap, there's this sense that you can connect. Like I was describing that connection with the space of the earth below. I think that having a dog close at you, it's like having a big piece of earth right with you, helping you slow down and connect. So in that they're connecting you to that sense of embodied presence, being present.
Okay, so that's a sense of being. It often gets parsed as not being lost in the past or future. A lot of people, commentators,
Yeah.
or a lot of authors in your book mention
Yeah.
that. And again, I sorry to use rubrics from Ken Wilber here, but one of the things I was wondering if you had any thoughts around this is that Ken talks about the idea of a pre-trans fallacy, where pre-egoic states often get confused with trans-egoic states, or
Yeah.
pre-personal states get confused with transpersonal states because they're both non-personal. And I was hearing a little bit, and this coming up in some of the voices in the book, that there's almost this idea that the dog embodies this being ideal that is prior to the egoic machinations that screw everything up. And if we could just get back to dog nature, then that would be the enlightened state. And I just want to throw that at you and see what your
Yeah.
response is.
Well, I think as human beings, it's our job to go trans-rational, not pre-rational. It's our job to go trans-personal. And so if we see a quality of being, we're not going to fall below the thinking mind and become like a dog that doesn't know how to engage in conceptual thinking, but we can be inspired by that to be a human being in which discriminating awareness, rational thinking occurs, but we know how to transcend that and connect in being with our dog, who might be pre-rational being. We can be post-rational being.
Well said. Any other sort of ways that our dogs are our peerless teachers?
Yeah, well, I'm going through one right now with a dog named Raspberry, who's 2 years old. Raz wants to play all the time. Okay, I like to work a lot. I don't like to play all the time, but she could literally play fetch 2 to 3 hours in the evening. I'm not exaggerating. She even if her tongue is hanging out the side of her mouth, she wants you to throw the ball one more time. So this is very interesting. Just the idea of someone like me being willing to play more. So I think she's inspiring me in that regard. I think another way, and this theme ran throughout the Dharma of Dogs, the book, is that because dogs have a relatively short lifespan, you have an intense bonding period. First couple years, who is this? Okay, you get a little bit of time, and then you have to say goodbye. And you're saying goodbye to a being who, they say it's, our best friend, not for no reason. I mean, for good reason. This incredible sense of purity, because there isn't all of the rational filters in that bond. It's so pure. And for many of us, for example, for me, one of the, purest kinds of loves I've ever known. So pure. And yet I had to say goodbye to Jasmine. And it was the biggest loss when she died that I'd ever experienced in my life. More gut-wrenching and heart-wrenching, really, than any other loss I'd ever experienced. And, I know sometimes people are shy to say that, like, I've lost this person, that person, but it was really my dog that, but let's just tell it the way it is if that's true for you. Mm-hmm. And I think many people in the book shared how it was during the loss of their beloved companion that they learned something about love and the heart opening. and something about eternity, something about a bond that won't be broken, that can never be broken. And what does that mean? What does that mean for the loved to live inside of you forever? What is that like? And I certainly know I learned that with jazz. So that's a big gift.
Yeah, and I would just echo what you're saying. That it seemed like reading the book actually was quite challenging at times because there was a sort of a consecutive string of searing eulogies to these dogs
Yeah,
that were lost, and some of them were really, really gripping stories and just uh, beautifully, poignantly said. And it's one thing that I've always been aware of with my own dog, that this is I'm on rented time in a way and borrowed time, and um, I do feel like that is one of the gifts, and it kind of connects back to the intimacy issue that
yeah,
with awareness of loss, the imminence of loss, there isn't time necessarily to really hold back.
exactly. And then, after Jasmine died, the decision to get another dog. We've gotten two dogs now. And, letting myself love wildly, knowing I'm going to lose these precious little squirts. I call them my rainbow squirts. Knowing I'm going to lose these precious little rainbow squirts in 10 to 15 years. But am I going to hold back? No, I'm going to do this. That's huge.
Yeah, yeah, I very much agree with you that the unconditional, constant love, the impending loss, and the awakening to that truth that emerges from that, all great things. I wonder too if there's a tendency to over idealize the value of the spiritual teaching of a dog. Like where some people refer to their dogs as their Zen masters and this and that. And are there ways that you think that a dog is sort of hopelessly unenlightened?
Well, of course, when you say that, I mean,
It's a setup, I know.
I wouldn't even apply a framework of enlightenment, which is a human framework about the human journey. I wouldn't apply that to a dog. What I
Good.
would say is if your dog teaches you how to open your heart and love,
Mhm.
and is the number one being in your life who's helped you open your heart, then they are an incredibly important spiritual teacher. Because if your spiritual path, whether it's on the cushion, whether it's reading fancy books, whatever it is, doesn't involve your heart splitting the F open completely, you are missing the most important part to me of the journey. There's something incomplete, hugely incomplete. And so to have that happen is, I think, absolutely critical. And interestingly, that for many people, it's a dog that does it. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I think it speaks again to what you were talking about earlier, is the safety that a dog provides.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the same uh, psychological hang-ups that are fraught in human dynamic.
Yes.
Um, are there any stories I did want to give you an opportunity to talk about some of the stories in the book that were most
Yeah.
resonant for you, or do you think that would maybe give a good teaser for someone to consider looking into the book?
Sure. Well, one of the stories that really moved me personally was from Adyashanti when he talked about the loss of the dog of his life when he was in his 20s. And he talked about reading a eulogy that he had written for his dog in the backyard while they were burying the dog, and how at the same time that he was grieving and there were tears falling from his eyes as he was reading the eulogy, literally big teardrops falling to the ground, something also opened in his experience that was like a light in the center of his chest. And that there was this sense that this tremendous love and light and the grief and sadness were two sides of the same coin. And to me, that was very beautiful to see, almost when he talked about it, almost like there was a smile inside the depth of grief. Like the deeper he went into the grief and let go into it completely, the more this tremendous joy and light was there as well. And I think that's part of the promise of loving so completely and then letting go so completely. So I love the way he describes that and the two sides that can come in loss.
Yes, and for people that may not know of Adyashanti, how would you describe him? He's sort of one of the premier enlightenment teachers out there right now.
Yeah, he was trained, by a Zen teacher for 14 years, and he says that when he woke up, he also woke up from Zen, and he has written many books, and with Sounds True, we have a new book coming out with him called The Most Important Thing. And one of the things he says in that book is the most important thing is to know what is the most important thing in your life. What is it? In any given moment, what is it?
Right. And the reason I was mentioning or bringing a little attention to him is that you can often think that if you've attained some degree of enlightenment, that you're going to be sort of safeguarded from these gut-wrenching losses and sorrows. But if anything, it seems to be in the story that you're sharing from him. It's the opposite.
Yeah, and one of the books he's written with Sounds True is called Resurrecting Jesus, and he looks into the experience of Jesus on the cross and the suffering, the actual physical, emotional suffering that Jesus went through, and helps us understand suffering from a different vantage point. So I wanted to bring that up as well, because I think it goes directly with what you're saying, that it's not that we don't suffer, but it's having a different view of suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important. The book, there's both spiritual teachers that are sharing their stories of their books. You have a lot of writers, novelists and writers that share their stories. And so it's a really nice spread of experience with dogs and meaning around dogs. One thing that I know I wanted to bring up with you is that in your work as a publisher and working with a whole spectrum of spiritual teachers, you've undoubtedly encountered certain teachers who have behaved, you might say, worse than dogs ethically over the time. And this is sort of a thing that we're coming to grips with in the West, is how do we reconcile very profound spiritual teachings when the mouthpiece of those teachings can behave in abhorrent ways. And I just, as someone in your role, I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts around what we do with spirituality in the West?
Well, I think there's three key points I'd like to make. The first is we don't keep our mouths silent, make excuses, and say it's okay. It's not okay. And I think we're in a time now, we see it in a different way with the Me Too movement, the value and the importance of people speaking up and saying, this isn't okay. Abuse in the name of a teacher trying to deliver a teaching, that's not okay. Any form of abusing power, money, authority, it's not okay. So that's one thing. We speak up. We don't put up with it.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Because oftentimes what I've heard is that, in a case where a teacher is being reprehensibly abusive, it's sometimes, and if the student does deign to criticize the teacher for the conduct or speak out against it, it's sometimes thrown in the student's face. It's kind of victim blaming that, if you're upset by this outrageous act, it's a sign of your unenlightened. You clearly are caught in a dualistic paradigm. Your morality is trapped within the conventional mode, and you haven't attained a significant degree of realization to see that this is just all one. Right?
Yeah, whatever the excuse is, whatever. We know when conduct is not kind, loving, human promoting. We know that. And why are we staying? Why, really? I think it's a growing up issue. Grow up and demand that the people who are our teachers embody ethical life in a way that we're proud of. So that would be, I would say that's the first thing. No excuses. The second is, how are we conducting ourselves? It's time for us not to just spend a bunch of time criticizing how teachers, this person's doing this, that, the other thing. What's your own relationship to human maturity in your life? What's the quality of your relationships? What's your relationship like with your body? What's your relationship like with the people closest to you, with the people you work with? What's your relationship like with money? How do you handle money? How maturely? How generously? So have a ruthless inventory with yourself and grow up in your own life and stop looking outward so much. And then the third point I want to make about this is to recognize that awakening experiences that we have. So we are touching and tasting and knowing what is beyond the body and mind. We have a sense of boundless consciousness in our life. We know that we have tastes of this. That doesn't mean that we are mature in every aspect of our life. And if you want to know the ways you're not mature, ask for some feedback and you'll get it. And then make a commitment to grow in those areas, and don't use your awakening experiences as some kind of stage that you stand on to avoid the totality of a 360-degree way of inhabiting who you are.
So you're saying that the last point, that you're sort of asking of the teacher to
I'm asking all of us.
I'm
asking all of us to say, let's just recognize that awakening is one dimension of our experience. Take a ruthless moral inventory of every other aspect of your life. You could, if you don't want to say moral, just developmental inventory of every other aspect of your life. And if you don't know how you need to grow, just ask a handful of people and a pattern will emerge pretty quickly. It's going to be right there. And then commit yourself to it. See what's underneath it. Do some heavy inquiry. Work with a therapist. Work with a group. Get feedback from a group. Get feedback from the people you work with. They know. They see it every day.
Right. I do think it gets quite tricky when you have a person quite high on a pedestal in some of these teaching models where there's one figure who doesn't necessarily ever see the need to ask for that feedback. It's usually in the wake of some sort of crisis where the whole community implodes, or the teacher's role implodes.
I don't think I would stay in a situation like that. Why would you stay in a situation like that? In that sense, you're colluding and contributing to teachers continuing to operate in that way.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you in that from the outside, it seems like it would. Why would you? Why would any rational person stay in these dynamics? And yet people do.
Until they don't.
Yeah.
Until they don't.
Yeah. Well, thanks for speaking on that, because I do think that's another important piece to bring out, particularly in light of. I knew someone listening to this would say, "Well, wait a minute, I know teachers that behave worse than dogs." So I had to feed you that question. Again, I just want to maybe close with just a thank you for everything you've done, with your work and the teachings that you made accessible, because it really has. I know so many people that have just reaped the benefit of contact with these teachings. And kind of coming back to the concept of intimacy, the intimacy of these teachings, listening to things with their headphones and having the teacher's voice just right there transmitting something has been really a powerful service. So
wonderful.
Thank you for your time, and
thank you for
Josh. Coming on. Thanks,
Thank you.
Tami.
Okay, many blessings.